he was out of town quite a bit on construction jobs. So, and we had the records to show that he was out of town, and sometimes in rural places where he was doing these construction gigs. And in those areas, it would have been easier to abduct young men and boys due to the rural nature of where he was. And obviously disposing of bodies would have been easier there too, as opposed to the urban setting where Gacy resided. So why would he have stopped when he was out of town? It just didn't make any sense. And, back then we didn't have the systems tying missing boys to different people. And when someone's traveling out of state, those things just didn't get connected. Someone could sit down one day with all of those records and look and see where Gacy was and see if boys disappeared during that time period and that location. But I don't know that anyone's ever going to sit down and do that. Back in the 70s, not all these men and boys were gay, but some of them were, and some of them were prostitutes. And, parents weren't going to come forward right away to say, were any of the bodies in Gacy's crawl space my son? Because that would have been an embarrassment to the family. So that was a whole different time, and you have to keep that in mind. Now it's different, and we did see some families come forward to at least try to attempt to identify the missing victims. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know that we're ever going to get any more answers. When you have 33 victims and all of their family members, and Gacy had made attempts on other young men and boys, I can't be in a crowded room where somebody doesn't know a Gacy story. Yeah. Or someone doesn't know a victim's family, the victim, an attempted victim, the police who worked on it, the neighbors. I mean, Gacy's story is part of Chicago, and it will always be. And remember, he served time in Iowa for trying to sodomize one of his employees. And there were some rumors that he had killed boys up there as well. So it could be that there were other victims prior to this killing spree in Chicago. We went and got Gacy's records of his business work, and he kept meticulous records. He was almost neurotic about his records, and his records showed that he was out of town when several of the boys went missing and were murdered. So even if you fudge it a couple days or two, Gacy wasn't in town for some of these murders. And people look at me and say, what do you mean he didn't kill all those boys? Well, there were two young men living with Gacy at the time who very likely, well, we know they dug the trenches, but they very likely helped Gacy dispose of them. And there were several victims who actually escaped from Gacy who said there were other people perpetrating the crimes, other people in the room, other people perpetrating the sex acts. So there's no question in my mind that there are other co-conspirators and co-perpetrators, as well as more victims. I focused on my job at hand, which really didn't have to do with these issues of actual innocence very much. Most of our efforts were focused on the execution and the method of execution and those types of things. But I did talk to him, and sometimes I would say to him, I said, John, those two young men were living with you and they dug the trenches. I mean, they had to have known what was going on. And Gacy, by the time I represented him, was really denying almost everything. He had confessed early on to his first lawyer, then he said he killed one, and then he changed his mind. So, you could never get a straight answer or an honest one from him. But I'm convinced in my mind those two boys were involved. One of them committed suicide after this whole thing, and the other one has a lawyer on permanent retainer. He was in denial about the fact that he was going to be executed. I'm not saying he was not in his right mind. I'm just saying he avoided thinking about those things and talking about them. And even the last day when I said my goodbyes to him, I asked him, I said, John, do you know what's going to happen? Are you okay? I just want to make sure you know what's happening. You lost all your appeals. We had the final one from the U.S. Supreme Court come down. And he said, I really don't want to talk about it. Lethal injection is supposed to be the painless way to execute somebody, but it has always been problematic. Number one, you can't have doctors and medical people involved in giving the lethal injection because of the Hippocratic oath that doctors and nurses swear to do no harm. So you have people who don't know how to give injections injecting somebody. What normally happens when you're cold, or sometimes a lot these defendants have used drugs, so their veins are just not susceptible to the injection. So there have been so many botched injections, and people think, well, it didn't hurt. I mean, they're just go to sleep. That's not the case. There were studies done that show that the first shot can calm you down so you don't have any tics and you don't have any movement. That doesn't mean that you're not feeling it. And at some point, Gacy suffocated to death over a 30-minute period. Now, most people would say, who cares? He deserves that. But again, if we're going to be in the business of executing people, we should do it in the way that is the least painful. The least painful is either the guillotine or the firing squad, because it's immediate, but nobody wants to see that blood and nobody wants to see a head roll. I was just doing my job, and I did it and volunteered to do it because I don't believe in the death penalty. And I was advocating for Gacy to try to save his life. He deserves a defense. Everyone in our country deserves a defense. But I was also advocating for the other people on death row who had defenses of actual innocence, or racially discriminatory things that happened in their trial, or had counsel that was ineffective because of their poverty level. So Gacy didn't have any of those issues, but I was making those arguments in public. I was making those arguments on paper to try to make the argument that the death penalty is wrong, even for Gacy. There are conspiracy theories that Gacy was protected by people in power. I've heard that many, many times. I'm not sure I have the facts to prove that, but Gacy was connected. And there were rumors that Gacy had a list of people who may have been gay and who may have been involved in some of this. And because at the time, there was no, being gay was frowned upon, and people lived double lives. Now, that's not to say that if you're gay you're a pedophile. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that I think Gacy knew secrets about people who were high up, and maybe they protected him, whether they knew he was doing something wrong or they just protected him because they couldn't imagine that he would be doing this. I don't know. Part of me believes it, just because if you look at the number of times he was connected with missing boys, how did they not put the pieces together? Even back in the 70s. And I talk about that in my book. There were just so many opportunities. I mean, here's a boy, he goes to work with Gacy, he disappears. Gacy's questioned, he said, oh, he was probably a runaway. Second person does it. How do you keep avoiding that? How do you keep, there was one victim who was tortured horribly, really horribly, who came running out of the house, and he found Gacy. He knew the car. He waited in the highway to look at the license plate. He found it. He went to the police. The police charged Gacy and then dropped the charges.